The crystalline spires of the Galactic Science Institute pierced the purple sky of Centauri Prime, their surfaces reflecting the light of three suns in dazzling patterns. Inside one of the towering structures, Kira Patel tried to make herself invisible among the assembled alien students. It wasn't easy being the only human in advanced theoretical physics, especially when your professor belonged to a species that considered humanity barely more evolved than primitive fungi. Professor Verith's crystalline body shimmered as he materialized at the front of the lecture hall, his thoughts projected directly into the students' minds through the neural interface all non-humans used. Kira alone relied on the clumsy translator device clipped to her ear, another reminder of her species' technological inadequacies. Today, Verith's projected thoughts resonated with characteristic disdain. We shall discuss the fundamental principles of 11-dimensional space-time manipulation. Though I doubt all present will grasp the complexities, his faceted eyes fixed pointedly on Kira. She forced herself to maintain eye contact, though her hands clenched under the desk. 6 months at the Institute had taught her that showing weakness only invited more contempt. Around her, the other students, beings of energy, crystalline entities, and multi-dimensional organisms, shifted in what passed for amusement among their kinds. Perhaps, Verith continued, our human guest would like to share her species' primitive understanding of spatial mechanics. I understand you still believe in something called string theory. Laughter rippled through the room in various forms of electromagnetic pulses and crystalline vibrations. Kira stood slowly, her heart pounding but her voice steady. Actually, Professor, I've been studying the Thylaxian papers on hyperspatial dynamics. I noticed some interesting inconsistencies in the base assumptions about quantum entanglement across dimensional boundaries. The amusement in the room shifted to tension. Questioning Thylaxian physics was tantamount to scientific heresy. Professor Verith's crystalline form darkened ominously. Inconsistencies. How bold of you to suggest such a thing. Please, enlighten us with your human perspective. Kira activated her handheld holoprojector, the device looking embarrassingly crude next to the neural interfaces her classmates used. But the equations that appeared in the air were anything but primitive. If we examine the Thylaxian principle of dimensional correspondence, there's an assumption about quantum state preservation across dimensional boundaries. But when you apply it to observe phenomena in human experiments with quantum teleportation, the numbers don't align. She highlighted a section of the equations, her fingers steady despite her racing heart. Either our measurements are wrong, all of them, across multiple human research facilities, or there's something fundamental about quantum mechanics that the current theory doesn't account for. The silence in the room grew heavier. Professor Verith's crystalline form had darkened to an almost opaque purple, a sign of intense emotion among his species. You dare to suggest that millennia of Thylaxian research is flawed based on crude human measurements? I'm suggesting, Kira replied, surprised by her own boldness, that perhaps there's value in examining problems from multiple perspectives, even primitive ones. Very well. Verith's projected thoughts carried an edge sharper than any verbal blade. If you're so confident in your analysis, you won't object to a proper academic challenge. 2 weeks from today, you will present a complete alternative theory that accounts for these supposed inconsistencies. You will defend it before the Institute's Board of Theoretical Physics. Kira's throat went dry. The board was composed of the most brilliant minds in the galaxy. No human had ever presented before them. And if I succeed, if, by some miracle, your theory holds up to scrutiny, I will personally recommend you for the Advanced Research Division. Verith's form lightened slightly, showing his certainty of victory. But when you fail, you will withdraw from the Institute and return to Earth, where you belong. Do you accept? Every rational part of Kira's mind screamed at her to back down. This was suicide. She had 2 weeks to either revolutionize physics or become the human who proved her entire species didn't belong among the stars. She thought of Earth, of the generations of scientists who had looked up at the stars and dreamed of understanding the universe's deepest mysteries, of all the humans who had been dismissed, underestimated, and mocked since first contact with alien civilizations. The news of Kira's challenge spread through the Institute like a quantum wave function collapse. Within hours, every sentient being on Centauri Prime seemed to know about the human who dared to question Scilaxian physics. In the vast library of the Institute, Kira sat surrounded by holographic displays, data tablets, and centuries of research from 100 worlds. "You're either incredibly brave or remarkably foolish," a melodious voice interrupted her concentration. Kira looked up to see an aurora being hovering nearby, its form a constantly shifting pattern of light and energy. It took her a moment to recognize Lyra, one of the few students who had never openly mocked her. "The jury's still out on that one," Kira replied, rubbing her tired eyes. She'd been working for 36 hours straight, sustained only by synthetic caffeine and determination. Lyra's form rippled in what Kira had learned to interpret as concern. "The Board of Theoretical Physics hasn't allowed a presentation from a non-founder species in over 3 centuries. The last one, well, let's just say their civilization is still trying to recover from the academic humiliation." "That's encouraging," Kira muttered, turning back to her calculations. The basic premise of her theory was sound. She was sure of it, but translating human intuition about quantum mechanics into something that would satisfy the rigid logical structures of alien physics was proving nearly impossible. "Perhaps," Lyra suggested, her light dimming to a gentle glow, "you're approaching this from the wrong angle. You're trying to prove them wrong, when you should be showing them what they're missing." Kira paused, her fingers hovering over the holographic keyboard. "What do you mean?" "Scilaxians pride themselves on perfect logic, on seeing the universe as a set of immutable equations. But from what I understand of humans, your species' strength lies in seeing patterns that transcend pure logic. You make intuitive leaps that sometimes defy explanation." "That's exactly why they don't take us seriously," Kira said. "We can't always explain how we know something, we just know it." Lyra's form pulsed with excitement. "But what if that's not a weakness? What if that intuitive understanding represents a fundamental truth about the universe that purely logical approaches can't capture?" Before Kira could respond, a shadow fell across her workstation. Professor Verith stood there, his crystalline form refracting the library's light into sharp, aggressive patterns. "I see you're recruiting help for your presentation," he said, his projected thoughts dripping with condescension. "I should warn you that any proof you present must be entirely your own work. We wouldn't want to add plagiarism to humanity's list of failures." Kira met his gaze steadily. "My work will be my own, Professor. Though I wasn't aware that discussing theoretical concepts with fellow students was forbidden." "Nothing is forbidden," Verith replied. "I merely want to ensure that when you fail, there can be no doubt about the outcome's validity." He turned to leave, then paused. "By the way, the board has expressed particular interest in your challenge. They've decided to make it a public presentation. The entire institute will be invited to attend." After he left, Kira slumped in her chair. "Great, now I get to fail in front of an audience. Or succeed," Lyra countered. "Tell me, what was it that first made you question the Scilaxian principle of dimensional correspondence?" Kira pulled up the original equations that had started it all. It was something in the quantum teleportation data. Every human experiment showed these tiny discrepancies, too small to matter for practical purposes, but they were consistent. According to Scilaxian theory, they shouldn't exist at all. But they do, and they follow a pattern. "Show me," Lyra said, moving closer to the holographic display. For the next several hours, they pored over the data together. Lyra's perspective as an energy being provided insights Kira would never have considered, while Kira's human intuition spotted connections that defied conventional analysis. As the triple suns of Centauri Prime set, casting the library in deep purple twilight, Kira began to see something emerging from the chaos of numbers and theories. "It's not about proving them wrong," she whispered, excitement building in her voice. "It's about showing them that there's more than one way to be right." She began to write furiously, her fingers flying over the holographic keys. The equations that took shape weren't purely Xylaxian, nor were they strictly human. They were something new, a bridge between intuition and logic, between pattern recognition and mathematical proof. Lyra watched in fascination as the theory developed. "This is either going to change everything," she said, or get me laughed off this planet," Kira finished. "But you know what? I don't care anymore. This feels right, and I'm going to see it through." As she worked through the night, other students began to drift into the library, drawn by curiosity or schadenfreude. They watched as the human who dared to challenge their understanding of physics built something that none of them had seen before. Some scoffed and left. Others stayed, their initial skepticism slowly giving way to reluctant interest. What none of them realized, not even Kira herself, was that they were witnessing more than just the development of a new physics theory. They were seeing the first steps toward a fundamental shift in how different species could work together to understand the universe. But first, she had to survive the presentation. 1 week before the presentation, Kira made a breakthrough that nearly destroyed everything. She was in her small laboratory space, running simulations on the Institute's quantum computer network, when the numbers suddenly aligned in a way that made her blood run cold. "This can't be right," she muttered, running the simulation again. The results remained unchanged. According to her calculations, the Xylaxian principle wasn't just slightly off. It was fundamentally incomplete. The implications were staggering. She sat back in her chair, running her hands through her disheveled hair. The data suggested that the very foundation of Xylaxian physics, their understanding of how dimensions interacted at the quantum level, was based on observations that only accounted for half of reality. It wasn't that they were wrong. They had built an incredibly complex and accurate model of the universe, but only of the parts they could perceive. Humans, with their primitive senses and limited understanding, had stumbled upon something that Xylaxians had missed precisely because they weren't looking for perfect logical patterns. Human messiness, human intuition, human willingness to embrace uncertainty, these had led them to discover aspects of quantum mechanics that the hyperlogical Xylaxians had filtered out as noise. "You look like you've seen a ghost," said a familiar voice. Lyra floated into the lab, her luminescent form dimmer than usual, suggesting concern. "Worse," Kira replied. "I've seen the truth, and I don't know if I should reveal it." She explained her discovery, watching as Lyra's form fluctuated between colors that indicated surprise, excitement, and worry. "This would devastate them," Lyra finally said. "The Xylaxians have built their entire civilization on the premise of their superior understanding of physics. To suggest that their basic assumptions are incomplete, it could destroy their society," Kira finished, "or at least their standing in the galactic scientific community." "Then perhaps you shouldn't present it," Lyra suggested gently. "Find another way to make your point, something less revolutionary." Kira stood up and began pacing the lab. "That's exactly what they expect from humans, to play it safe, to stay within the boundaries they've set for us. But science isn't about protecting egos or maintaining the status quo. It's about finding truth, no matter how uncomfortable that truth might be." She pulled up her original presentation and began to modify it, incorporating the new discovery. As she worked, other pieces fell into place. The quantum teleportation discrepancies, the dimensional boundary problems, even some unexplained phenomena in human consciousness studies, they all connected to this fundamental insight about the nature of reality. Word of her continued work spread through the Institute, and soon her lab began receiving unexpected visitors. A group of quantum theorists from the Pleiades cluster stopped by, ostensibly to critique her methodology, but staying to ask increasingly detailed questions. A researcher from the mysterious Void Dwellers spent 3 hours silently observing her calculations before departing without a word. Even some younger Xylaxian students began to show interest, though they were careful to maintain their distance whenever Professor Verith was around. One of them, a junior researcher named Nexer, actually approached her late one night. "Your approach is unorthodox," he said, his crystalline form vibrating with what might have been excitement or anxiety. "But there's something compelling about it, something that feels true," Kira suggested. Nexer's form clouded briefly. "Truth is absolute," he said, but there was uncertainty in his projected thoughts. "Is it?" Kira pulled up a display showing quantum probability weights. "Or is truth more like this, a superposition of multiple possibilities, all existing simultaneously until we observe them?" The conversation lasted until morning, and by the end, Kira had gained not just an ally, but an insight into how to present her discovery. She couldn't just show them the math. She had to help them feel the intuitive truth that had led her there. As the day of the presentation drew closer, Kira refined her theory with a new purpose. She wasn't just defending human physics anymore. She was building a bridge between two ways of understanding the universe. The question was whether the Xilaxians and the rest of the galactic scientific community were ready to cross it. The night before the presentation, she sat alone in her lab, reviewing everything one last time. The equations were solid. The logic was impeccable. But more importantly, the truth was there, waiting to be seen by anyone willing to look with both their mind and their intuition. "Well," she said to the empty room, "tomorrow we find out if the galaxy is ready for a little human chaos in their perfect order." She didn't know it yet, but her presentation would do more than challenge Xilaxian physics. It would spark a revolution in how different species approach the greatest mysteries of the universe, and remind everyone that sometimes the most profound discoveries come from the most unexpected sources. The grand amphitheater of the Galactic Science Institute hummed with anticipation. Three-dimensional holograms floated above every seat, allowing the thousands of assembled beings, from energy constructs to silicon-based life forms, to observe the proceedings from multiple perspectives simultaneously. Kira stood at the center of it all, her simple human form seeming almost primitive compared to the crystalline magnificence of the Xilaxian board members arranged in a semicircle before her. Their faceted bodies caught the light from three suns streaming through the transparent dome above, creating a dazzling display that would have been intimidating even if they weren't about to judge her entire species' scientific credibility. "Begin," commanded Chief Theorist Zixtal, the oldest and most respected member of the board. His thought projections carried the weight of millennia of scientific authority. Kira activated her holoprojector, and the space around her filled with equations. She had spent hours making sure the presentation would be visible to all species present, including those that perceive reality in more dimensions than humans could comprehend. "Esteemed members of the board, fellow scientists," she began, her voice steady despite her racing heart. "For centuries, we have understood the universe through the elegant framework of Xilaxian physics. Its precision and logical beauty are undeniable." She paused, noting how some of the board members' crystals brightened slightly at the acknowledgement. "But today, I stand before you not to challenge this framework, but to expand it, to show you something that has been here all along, hiding in plain sight." The first set of equations expanded, showing the familiar patterns of quantum entanglement across dimensional boundaries. "These are the foundation stones of our current understanding. Perfect, precise, and incomplete." A murmur rippled through the audience. Professor Verith, watching from the front row, darkened ominously. "Observe," Kira continued, bringing up the data from human quantum teleportation experiments. These discrepancies were dismissed as measurement errors, as human imprecision. But they're not random. They follow a pattern that exists precisely because humans aren't perfect observers. The equations began to shift and merge, taking on new forms. Our very imperfection, our inability to filter out what Xilaxian sensors consider noise, led us to stumble upon something remarkable. The universe isn't just logical. It's also playful. She heard shocked whispers at her use of such an unscientific term, but pressed on. The holographic display now showed a complex dance of probabilities and possibilities, patterns within patterns that seem to defy traditional mathematical description. What we humans lack in precision, we make up for in our ability to recognize patterns that transcend pure logic. And when you combine this with Xylaxian precision, the equations merged again, forming something entirely new. You get this. The amphitheater fell silent as the implications of her theory became clear. It wasn't just a refinement of existing principles. It was a fundamental reimagining of how the universe worked at its most basic level. Chief theorist Zixtal leaned forward, his crystalline form refracting light in complex patterns. You are suggesting, his thoughts projected carefully, that our understanding of dimensional mechanics is accurate but incomplete, Kira finished. Just as human understanding is intuitive but imprecise, neither approach alone gives us the full picture. But together, she triggered the final simulation. Above the amphitheater, reality itself seemed to twist and fold, showing how the universe behaved when viewed through both lenses simultaneously. The display was beautiful, a perfect fusion of logical precision and intuitive understanding. The silence stretched for what felt like eternity. Then, from the back of the amphitheater, a sound began. It was Lyra, her energy form pulsing with multiple frequencies, the aurora equivalent of applause. Slowly, others joined in. The quantum theorists from the Pleiades, the Void Dwellers, even some young Xylaxians. Professor Verith stood abruptly. This is preposterous. You cannot seriously be considering. Silence, commanded Zixtal. His form had taken on a deep blue hue that none of the other Xylaxians had ever seen before. In all my centuries, I have never seen anything quite like this. It is disturbing, revolutionary, and possibly the most important discovery since our species first understood quantum mechanics. Kira held her breath as the board members communicated silently among themselves, their crystalline forms shifting through various colors. Finally, Zixtal turned back to her. We find your theory not only valid but essential to our continued understanding of the universe. You have shown us that there is value in imperfection. The last word seemed to cause him physical discomfort. The board hereby recommends your immediate appointment to the Advanced Research Division, with full funding to explore the implications of your discovery. The amphitheater erupted in a cacophony of reactions: light, sound, electromagnetic pulses, and quantum fluctuations. Kira stood in the center of it all, tears in her eyes, as she realized she had done more than defend her theory. She had opened a door between two ways of seeing the universe, and nothing would ever be quite the same again. 6 months after the historic presentation, the Galactic Science Institute had changed in ways both subtle and profound. In the newly established Department of Hybrid Physics, humans worked alongside Xylaxians and other species, combining logical precision with intuitive leaps to unlock mysteries that had puzzled the galaxy for millennia. Kira sat in her new office, its walls lined with both holographic displays and old-fashioned whiteboards covered in equations. She smiled as she watched a young Xylaxian researcher named Nexer struggle to explain a concept to his human colleague using purely intuitive terms. Perhaps, he projected, his crystalline form shifting in frustration, if we consider it like a dance. The word seemed to pain him, but he was trying. Now you're getting it, Kira said, rising from her desk. The past months had seen dozens of breakthroughs as different species learned to complement each other's strengths. The Xylaxians' perfect logic combined with human intuition had already led to improvements in quantum teleportation efficiency. The Aurora's understanding of energy patterns, merged with Void Dweller perception of dark matter, had opened new avenues in space travel theory. A familiar shimmer announced Lyra's arrival. The board wants to see you. Her energy form pulsed with excitement. They're ready to approve the expansion. Kira nodded, gathering her materials. The Institute was about to launch its most ambitious project yet, a multi-species research initiative aimed at understanding consciousness itself, combining approaches from a dozen different civilizations. As she walked through the Institute's crystalline corridors, She passed Professor Verith's old classroom. He had initially refused to participate in the new collaborative approach, but even he had gradually begun to change. Just last week, she had spotted him engaged in an animated discussion with a human physicist about the role of uncertainty in quantum measurements. The board chamber looked different now. Where once there had been only Xylaxian crystal configurations, now there were accommodation spaces for all manner of species. Chief theorist Zixtel's form glowed with a warm amber as she entered, a color that would have been unthinkable in its Xylaxian just months ago. Dr. Patel, he projected, using her new title with what seemed like pride. We have reviewed your proposal for the Consciousness Studies Initiative. It is most unusual. That's rather the point, isn't it? Kira replied with a smile. We're not just studying the universe anymore. We're studying how different species perceive it, and what those different perceptions can teach us when combined. The board members communicated silently for a moment, their crystals shifting through various hues. Finally, Zixtel spoke again. There was a time when we believed our understanding of physics was complete. You showed us not only that we were wrong, but that being wrong could be valuable. Being wrong is often the first step toward being right in a new way, Kira said. She thought back to that first confrontation in the lecture hall, how close she had come to backing down. We just have to be brave enough to admit what we don't know. The proposal is approved, Zixtel announced, and we have decided to name it the Patil Initiative for Multi-Perspective Physics. As Kira left the board chamber, she found Lyra waiting outside. They approved it. They did more than that, Kira replied, still stunned. They're naming it after me. Of course they are. Lyra's form sparkled with amusement. You didn't just change physics, Kira. You changed how we think about thinking. Later that evening, Kira stood at the observation dome, watching the three suns of Centauri Prime set in a spectacular display of color. A group of students passed behind her, human, Xylaxian, Aurora, and others, all engaged in animated discussion about a new theory they were developing together. She thought about Earth, about all the generations of humans who had looked up at the stars and dared to imagine understanding them. They had been right, in their way. Understanding the universe wasn't just about perfect equations or precise measurements. It was about being willing to see things differently, to combine perspectives, to embrace both logic and intuition. As the last sun dipped below the horizon, Kira smiled. The universe was vast and mysterious, full of wonders they had yet to comprehend. But for the first time, they were learning to look at it through all their eyes at once. Crystal, energy, void, and human alike. The challenge that had started as a defense of human physics had become something far greater, a bridge between ways of thinking, a fusion of approaches that promised to reveal more about the cosmos than any single species could have discovered alone. And this was just the beginning.